Taito is going made in USA. Capcom launches the CP System 1. And with the PS2 launch looming, the Dreamcast is thinking, I might be in trouble. These stories and many more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. I'm Carl, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Peter. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It never gets old, does it?
Never get old. Not even after 1 year.
And it's true. This show has been going for a whole year. November of this year marks the 1 year anniversary of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. And yeah, I'm kind of amazed that we made it this long. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, we're still able to sit right next to each other.
And not want to kill each other.
Yeah. Sure.
Well, it's not yet your 1 year anniversary on the show. Let's be clear about that. You came into it a little bit late.
Okay.
So when did you come in? It was March. It was February or March. Yeah,
something like that.
So those first few episodes, I had to fly solo. It was not
awful.
Pretty. It was pretty awful. Terrible.
But no, I'm here, so it's gonna be awesome.
Excellent, and it will continue to be so.
Yeah.
So we got 1 year down, 9 to go, and then this will be perfect.
And let's just start all over again.
Yeah, definitely. That first episode or two definitely needs to be re-recorded. There's some terrible stuff in there.
Then we can bring out the remastered version of it and charge even more.
Wait, we're supposed to be charging for this? Oh,
yeah, and shout out to our Patreon user.
Yes, shout out to our Patreons. Thank you guys very much for continuing to support us every month. Anybody else who wants to join in, the link's in the description below.
It's a pretty fancy club, guys.
It's very exclusive.
Yeah.
I don't know about fancy, Ritz crackers with a little bit of peanut butter, but it is exclusive. And we'd love you to all join in and break down those barriers and make us a more socially equal club in the Patreon.
What he said.
Exactly. Okay, that was my soapbox meanderings on socialism. And
back to the important things in life.
Remember, for those just joining us for the first time, and we did get a lot of new listeners last month, so the format here on the show is that every month we will look back at the biggest stories in and around the video game industry this month for November of 1979, November of 1989, and November of 1999. As always, we'll mostly be using magazine cover dates. And of course, the magazines are printed a little bit later. So obviously the news stories happened before the magazine cover date, but this at least gives us a framework since most magazines have the same run time going into things. Well, remember, send comments to us over Twitter at VideoGameNewsR2 or send us an email to videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. Or just check us out on YouTube. We're there too with really nice, pretty picture each month you can stare at for hours and hours as we blabber on. Yeah,
those are really nice pictures.
Oh, thank you. I try to put a little bit of effort. I try to get creative with it,
You can see that you put in some effort.
That is a wonderfully non-binding amount of effort you are describing right there. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, let's stop the jibber jabber because everybody's here for one thing and one thing only, our wonderful analysis of old news. So let's turn on the time machine and head back to November of 1979.
Oh, and by the way, if any of you listeners wants to send us some time traveling sounds, it would be amazing, and we would definitely use them.
Because we're
too lazy
and we kind of suck with the sound to do anything else. So, okay, what's our first story?
Yes, the FCC regulates the computer market.
The FCC has, the Federal Communications Commission, has published its decision concerning the regulation of the microcomputer market. They have created two classes of computers. Class A, computers marketed primarily to business, commercial, and industrial uses, and Class B, computers marketed primarily to the home market. The home market machines will have a much more stringent set of guidelines for the kind of RF interference they will be allowed to generate.
So why were those Class A types more relaxed regulated?
Because the fear was that it would interfere with television reception.
Yes.
And especially in the United States, where you have zoning laws which prohibit homes from being in the same parts of the city as industrial uses or businesses, it didn't really make any difference. As long as the business machine was in another part of town, you weren't worried about it. You were mainly worried about the person in the house next door, or the person in the apartment next door interfering with your reception, or even worse, little Johnny's video game in the next room interfering with Dad's Monday Night Football.
Okay, you don't want to interfere with Dad's football.
No, you don't want to interfere with Dad's football.
No.
That is a trauma I can definitely confirm is not something you want to do.
Okay.
But the regulations are a bit complex. There's awesome history here. And we are lucky enough that Dale, also known as Quarterpast on Twitter, will be sitting down with us for a special mini episode on the history of these regulations and how they shaped the early microcomputer field. He's going to be recording that with us next week. We're recording this on the 6th of November. So he's going to be recording that with us next week, and we'll be posting that as a extra episode, like one of our interview episodes, like with Ed Zarin or Al Lowe. And it will be going up on Patreon first, so the patrons will get first dibs at that wonderful content, and it'll probably be going to everybody else a week later. So, sign up for Patreon.
Yeah, another incentive. I told you, it's a pretty fancy club.
It is a very fancy club. Exclusive. Let's not go fancy. Fancy promises things. Exclusive just means not a lot of people.
Okay,
so
some effort.
Exactly.
Moving on.
Next story.
Last month we got VisiCalc, and this month we get WordStar.
Now, I know this is a podcast about video games, but there are certain milestones in home computing that are important to mention. And a thorough review of WordStar can be found in the November 21st issue of the Intelligent Machines Journal. The link is below. But the important thing here is that for the low... well, if you're listening to this in a podcast app or on our website or on YouTube,
and it's
below where the player is,
okay.
below where the player controls are, you will find a list of all of our sources. And in those sources, you will find a link to a scan of this article. Now, for the low price of just $495 in 1979 money, so triple that approximately for today, you can get the power of word processing on your home machine. Now, WordStar had a ton of amazing features for the time, including typesetting functionality, automatic indentation, etc. While a bit difficult to use, lots of shortcuts to memorize, remember this is pre-GUI days, it would be the industry standard for the better part of a decade. Now, George R.R. Martin still uses the 4.0 version of this on an old DOS machine to this very day. So
this is pretty amazing.
It is. But the important thing here is with WordStar, a combination of VisiCalc and WordStar really were milestones in setting up how useful a home computer could actually be. It went from being a hobbyist thing where you had to program all your applications yourself to something where you could buy it with a little bit of training or reading through manuals. A normal everyday person who knew nothing about programming could now do something truly productive with the machine. And this is going to spread the proliferation of home computers. It's going to be the great excuse for, Johnny can use it to help with his homework, and all Johnny's really going to do is play video games. But the spread of home computers is going to basically create that next generation of programmers. So the guys who are getting these computers here at this point are going to become the John Carmacks, the John Romeros, and so forth of the late 80s, early 90s, and so forth.
Well, and also those kind of programs make those computers more interesting for businesses, right?
Of course, because whereas only relatively large companies could afford computers before, and the computers that smaller mom and pop shops could afford really didn't have any functionality without a massive investment of time and effort, now suddenly you could have a small hardware store, or you could have a small factory shop, maybe 10 employees. They could now use the computer for their bookkeeping and everything else. They could actually now do all this stuff without having to spend a massive amount of money. And it's going to really revolutionize a lot of ways small businesses run. So, interesting little side note, but I promise you we're back to gaming. What are we talking about now?
Yay. Taito opens an American plant.
Taito, the Japanese juggernaut responsible for Space Invaders, announces that they are opening a manufacturing facility in Elk Grove, Illinois. While Taito of America has been around since 1973, they will now be able to manufacture arcade cabinets in the US instead of licensing them out to American manufacturers. Taito would remain in Elk Grove until 1985. Their facility is currently an electronics recycling company called eWorks. I looked this up on Google Maps, and curiously enough, Stern Pinball, the last big American pinball manufacturer, is currently located in Elk Grove, just 5 minutes from Taito's old site. It's literally, you could walk there. It was kind of cool just to see that. But yeah, Elk Grove is a suburb of bigger city. A lot of manufacturing was, especially in this area, was going on there back then. And, well, they're not going to be completely reliant on companies like Midway for the distribution of their games in North America anymore.
So after opening their plant, did they cancel all the distribution contracts and do it themselves?
No. It took them a while to really get up to speed, and so Space Invaders Deluxe / Space Invaders Part 2, the 2-player version of Space Invaders and the cocktail cabinet and so forth, those still came out through Midway. They did some deals with other companies as well. I believe I have to go into the whole history of which license they sold where, but they still did do some licensing for a while, but this was the beginning of them becoming more independent in the U.S. market.
Okay.
Yeah. So, fun stuff. And sticking with the arcades.
Yes, AMOA show preview.
That's right. The Amusement and Music Operators Association, or AMOA show for 1979 will start at the beginning of November in Chicago. Now, Replay Magazine previews some of the expected highlights, including Gorgar from Williams, the first pinball game that speaks with the player. And Atari will premiere future classics such as Asteroids and Missile Command.
So, what did the pinball machine tell you?
Actually, I did include a YouTube link in the show notes. There's a point in the game where the ball gets caught. So a ball hold. I'm blanking completely on the proper pinball terminology here. But at that point, Gorgar says something like, I have the ball, or whatnot, or you have injured Gorgar, or Gorgar is basically this demon character on the backboard. And
so no need for it to sound like an actual living being. It can just be some weird sounds that sound like someone talking.
The sounds are not what you would call high fidelity CD quality samples, and there's not a ton of them either. But the fact that they're getting this done through solid state electronics, that it's not a tape drive or anything else, is already a huge deal. So the synthesis, I mean, and speech synthesis is nothing new at this point. Speak and spell has been around for a little bit. But the fact that they're making a character and putting it into a machine like a pinball machine is really showing just how fast the solid state movement, no longer being electromechanical inside the pinball machine, but more driven by chips and hard silicon, is really taking off.
The future is now.
The future is now, or then.
Oh, then.
And yes,
The future was
so,
then.
And there's going to be some highlights at the AMOA show that Replay doesn't really see coming. We'll talk about it more next month when they have the full report on the show. There's some really interesting and groundbreaking games that come out at this show.
Okay. I like that
So-
we are more foreshadowing. This episode, last episode, we're always foreshadowing to the next episode. This is awesome.
Well, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that was making headlines, and now that we've got some more hopefully regular listeners, this is the kind of thing where next month you come back and we'll tell you, oh yeah, we were looking forward to this. Let's see what happens. It's very good. Wait until we get to our 1999 jump this month. So,
Yeah.
Okay, sticking with the arcades.
Yes, Joe Keenan becomes president of Pizza Time Theater.
So,
Those names.
a year ago, on our very first episode, we talked about how Nolan Bushnell basically went on a tirade at a shareholders, not a shareholders meeting, but at a management meeting for Warner Brothers, and essentially gets kicked out of Atari. Well, on his way out, he took a little side project with him called Pizza Time Theater, and he has now started to build that up, and the new venture has gained a new president, Joe Keenan. Now, Keenan was Bushnell's neighbor and the former head of Key Games, the Atari-owned subsidiary that was set up to pretend to compete with Atari in the arcade market to bypass regional exclusivity agreements. And now he has been named the president of Pizza Time Theater. He would remain in that position until 1984, when the company would hit hard times.
Wait, so they set up a company just to compete with them.
And yes, sadly, we didn't really get the opportunity to get into this because of when the show started. But yeah, Key Games was a subsidiary of Atari that was marketed or advertised as an independent company. That they had their own games, but it was usually either a modification of an existing Atari game, or Atari would then make a modification of a Key game, and so forth.
Okay.
They were housed in the same building, used slightly different addresses, but they were in the same building. And what Key Games did was would sell games to regional distributors. And the way that the arcade business worked back then was that the entire country was divided up into distribution regions. Each region would have multiple distributors, and the distributors would demand an exclusive contract. So Atari, if they signed a deal with a distributor in the Northeast, that whatever that region would be, they would say, well, you're not allowed to sell to any other distributors.
And Atari actually agreed to those
Well,
conditions.
this was the thing. The distributors were tight enough with one another, and they had such a hold on their region that you couldn't break it, and no distributor would go against it because it would hurt them as well.
You know what's that called?
It's called a
Cartel.
cartel.
Yeah.
Cartel.
Cartel.
Yes. It is a cartel, and that's
Okay.
exactly what it was. But it was a cartel in an industry that was small enough that nobody seemed to care.
Okay.
And so Atari wasn't big enough, especially at the beginning, to break that. It would fall apart a little bit later on, but they weren't big enough to break it. So Bushnell just did the reasonable thing. He opened up a second company, and so he locked down 2 distributors in each region as opposed to just 1. And so this gave him twice as many outlets for sale of games,
Yeah.
whereas everybody else was stuck with just 1 outlet for the sale of games.
Clever guy.
Very clever guy. Only he wasn't quite as good a manager as Joe Keenan was, and Key Games ended up being a far more successful company than Atari in many regards, with the distribution of games. But later on, that would all kind of get melded back together again once Atari was big enough that the distribution network no longer mattered. They weren't beholden to them because Atari was so big.
We don't need you anymore.
Kind of like that. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a more complex story than that, but... so now Joe has left and come to Pizza Time Theater. And Pizza Time Theater, for those not in the know, is what is basically Chuck E. Cheese. So it starts out as Pizza Time Theater, I believe, with Chuck E. Cheese or presented by Chuck E. Cheese or something. And then it grows and grows from there. And we will be talking about it a little bit more next month.
Yeah.
Ha ha ha. So,
But Pizza Time Theater, I'm not in the know. Is it like a theater, a go-to place where you can have pizza?
This is right. Okay, sorry, I keep focusing on North American listeners. Okay, Chuck E. Cheese was the greatest freaking thing on the planet.
We are
Chuck
not
E.
paid
Cheese,
by them.
No. And it's no longer the Chuck E. Cheese of old. But when I was a kid, Chuck E. Cheese is literally where I get my first real exposure to video games. It is how I discovered my love of video games. It's where I see Dragon Slayer for the first time. And so...
Some people are talking like this about their first kiss. Others focus on the more important stuff in life.
I hate it. I love my wife dearly, but the relationship I have with her will never last as long as the relationship I've had with video games. Just because it started way, way earlier. So...
And you're not taking into consideration that your relationship to video games might end way earlier than the relationship to your wife.
No.
Okay, just to make sure.
That option doesn't exist in my reality. Thank you very much. But no, it's...
Is your wife listening to this?
Believe me, I've tried to get her to listen. She's just like, really? Seriously? She looks at me with those rolling eyes and just looks like, yeah, no, that's not happening.
Okay.
So, the deal with Chuck E. Cheese was, it was a combination where you came in, and they would have the giant ball pit. They would have a ton of video games and skee ball and similar attractions. Then they would also have a giant room with benches, and you could order pizza and eat pizza. And the pizza was never any good, but okay. And then they would have these animatronic dolls, life-size animatronics of anthropomorphic animals. So Chuck E. Cheese was this rat in a little bowler hat and a red outfit, and there'd be a bunch of other characters, and they would then sing songs and move around and stuff. And then they even had side rooms. There was one with a hippo in a ballerina outfit. Then there was another one of this lion dressed in a white leisure suit with rhinestones that would sing Elvis Presley cover songs. Yeah, and you would actually put a quarter into a device on the side, and then he'd play a random song and move around and shake his hips and everything. It was bizarre.
And I think you had to be there.
It was an experience. It was the whole thing was an experience. I remember going there with my parents. My dad's a huge Elvis fan, so we had to sit in the room with the Elvis singing lion.
Of course.
And, he'd just be waiting for him to sing another Elvis song. And then I'd go out and play a couple of rounds of either Star Trek or try to play Popeye and constantly die. Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man. I'd stare at Dragon's Lair, but I wouldn't dare put two of my precious quarters, because I maybe had 6 quarters for the whole night. 2 quarters to play Dragon's Lair was too much, but just staring at the game was enough for me at that age. And no, Chuck E. Cheese was a phenomenon. It was everywhere. And they had the chain spread across the country in no time. And they're still around today. Now, been reconstructed, rebranded, reinvented several times. It's a pale comparison to what it used to be. There's no more animatronics or anything like that. They've gone much cheaper with it, and they've gone for a much younger audience. But, it was the family-friendly arcade.
Okay.
which wasn't always the case back then. Arcades were often considered a place for ne'er-do-wells, the teenagers playing hooky from high school and stuff, hanging out in a dark little
Smoking.
shop in a strip mall someplace or something.
Okay.
And Chuck E. Cheese was the kid-friendly, family-friendly, everybody's having a good time.
It was a trap, man. They wanted to get you into those shady arcades.
They didn't want to get me into the shady arcades. They wanted to get me into that high-end, cheap, horrible-tasting pizza arcade. That's where they wanted me, and they had me. Oh, I couldn't go to Chuck E. Cheese often enough. It was awesome. So, okay, yeah, that's Pizza Time Theater. And sticking with Atari-related news,
Yeah, Atari Chess is coming.
after lengthy delays, the Atari VCS will finally get a chess cartridge. On the most difficult setting, the game can take an average of 10 hours per move.
What?
Yeah. Personal Computing Magazine speaks with one of the two creators of the game, Larry Wagner. Now, Larry had left Atari to work at Voltan on voice recognition and synthesis. I'm gonna kill this. Synthesize. Yeah.
This is how it feels, man.
Synth-
This is how it feels.
Software to synthesize sounds. The other co-creator, Bob Whitehead, would become one of the four original Activision founders who left Atari in October to form the world's first third-party publisher.
So who would want to play a chess session that went on for like a year?
Well, you wouldn't play it at that high level necessarily. The fact that it was in the advertising that you could even do that is kind of beside the point. The real fact here is, and the interesting thing is that at this point, for example, Personal Computing Magazine has a multi-page section every month just dedicated to chess programs, to programming chess.
Okay.
So you have this big magazine that is not wasting, but dedicating this at least 4 or 5 pages every month just to chess. The importance of programming chess to the early hobbyist community cannot be overstated. This was like the holy grail, was to create a chess program.
So why is that? Because the AI has to be so sophisticated, or the drawing of the chessboard is so complicated, or what is it?
It is mainly the AI aspect on the computers.
Okay.
The board obviously as well, but the AI. So it was always seen like this is the holy grail, to get a computer to play a decent game of chess. And it had the added advantage that everybody knew the rules. So one person's effort to make a better AI is immediately understood by everybody. Whereas, for example, the AI, the computer-controlled characters in a game like Temple of Apshai, well, that's limited by the rules of that game.
Yeah.
And no two people are going to make another game with the same exact rules. Therefore, their AI routines aren't going to work in another setting.
But by that rule, you can basically take older board game like backgammon, or how is it?
Backgammon was also a big one. Backgammon was also a big one, but chess was always considered the game of games, especially because backgammon has dice. Well, also remember, backgammon has dice. So now you have a random number generator.
Yeah.
Whereas because chess is a pure respond to what the other person is doing, and you don't have a random factor, the AI routine is more not predictable, but is more plannable.
Yeah.
And so the fact that the VCS is getting a chess game with its extremely limited memory is a big, huge deal. Now, I have been in touch with Larry Wagner, and I'm trying to set up a date for an interview. Hopefully we'll get that, and we'll be able to add that as another Patreon exclusive here in the next couple of weeks, an interview with Larry Wagner about the creation of this chess program and what it meant at the time and how it all fit together. But just the fact that it existed on a VCS is magic. It almost feels like a trick that you could get a proper chess program or a functional chess program on here, especially because almost all the other chess programs at this point are still being controlled by putting in a letter number combination. So you put in, J2 to I3 or whatever. And this is doing it with a joystick. So now you also basically have a rudimentary GUI.
Yeah.
Because you have to be able to click on one, then move to someplace else. So there's a whole other dimension of the usability, the interactivity, and the AI routine, all built into one little miniature cartridge. So huge, huge deal. But, okay. And in more Atari news...
Yeah, now it's getting nasty. Atari tries to touch Simon.
Okay, that sounds awkward. After last year's must-have toy sensation Simon, created by Ralph Baer, took the holiday season by storm, Atari has jumped into the electronic toy world with their handheld version of the memory game with the clearly not focus group tested name, Touch Me. The small handheld replicates Simon's 4-color setup, but because the lights are not hidden behind large slabs of plastic, the red LED limitations of the time do take a bit of the colorfulness away from the game.
First of all, who came up with the name and was he fired?
I don't believe they were fired. Now, to put this
she?
into some context, Atari did release an arcade game using the Simon principle before Ralph Baer's Simon comes out.
Okay.
Ralph Baer, however, being the slightly better engineer and designer, was the one who comes up with the fun little circular shape and the 4 colors.
Yeah.
So what Atari is doing now is trying to make a small handheld version of that game with the limitations of handheld devices at the time.
So you can play it on the go or in the car, and
exactly,
you
and it's
just
never really
ask
going to do
some
much.
random dude on the street, hey, wanna play Touch Me?
Hey, you want to touch me?
Yeah.
I'm sure that that's not going to get anybody injured or slapped or whatever else is going to happen there. But what I can say is that I would not recommend calling anything Touch Me nowadays. It's just like Tickle Me Elmo probably isn't going to sell. So, yeah. But the game tries to mimic the Simon mechanism, but yeah, without the colored lighting effects, it's not quite the same. So
yeah, I don't know whether or not that thing is fun. I mean, we are right now we are looking at it in the
there's
YouTube
a
video.
YouTube video link in the show notes where you can actually see what the device look like. And I mean, yeah, it's one
you don't want
player
to play it
Simon.
for yourself, right? This is the thing. You want to play it with someone else. You know, the big thing in the middle of some people. I mean, even the original Simon wasn't that big that you can just take it anywhere with you. You just can't play it in the tram or something or on the bus.
Well, you could, but everybody else, after listening to the sounds for about 2 minutes, would want to shoot you. Yeah.
A feeling that is totally justified.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the Atari idea here is fun, and it's also interesting to see how Atari is trying to really get into that handheld electronic game market.
Yeah.
I mean, they're already deep at this point into the VCS.
Yes.
They're just launched home computers. So this just seems like almost them going into one more market, and also arcades, obviously. So it's a tough sell if you ask me. But yeah, hey, it's another game. It sold okay. I couldn't find any actual numbers on the sales of it, but I found enough references of people having them or talking about them that it shouldn't be a problem.
Interesting. Well, moving on.
Next story.
Yeah. Electronic games are big business for Xmas.
Sears releases their 1979 wish book, and electronic games are taking up a whopping 19 pages of the book. Everything from game consoles to home computers, chess games to handheld sports games. Even programmable tanks are in the mix.
Programmable tanks.
Yeah, it's a little toy tank, and it had a keypad on the top, and you could actually give it commands, and so you could pre-program. It would go so far forward, then it would turn to the right, then it would go so far forward, then turn to the left, go so far forward, and so on and so forth.
We are in the time of the oil crisis, aren't we?
The oil crisis is it's either already here or looming at this point. Yes.
So you need to get your kids ready for military. Good thinking.
Please, tank toys and stuff. That's as old as time itself. G.I. Joe is basically is dying out right now. Star Wars toys have taken over. Remember, one of the big reasons the Star Wars toys in their smaller form factor were so popular was because the oil crisis made larger dolls less financially viable. The original G.I. Joes were 12-inch figures. The 3 3/4-inch figures of the Star Wars line really saved on raw materials.
Okay.
But yes.
Also, I'm, strangely looking at the word wish book. Was it like you being a kid get this book sent to you by this company, and you have boxes that you can check and hand your mom and be like, this please?
It's less like that and more. When I was a kid, we would actually go to Sears, to one of the Sears locations, and pick up one of the catalogs. They just had them sitting there. I don't recall if we had to pay for it or not. You may have had to drop like $1
awesome.
for the catalog, but I cannot remember. I can't remember that. But yeah, so you would just pick up one of the catalogs, take it home, and it was 600 and some pages long. So you could order everything from clothes to washing machines to doll houses to a sewing machine, whatever. It's all in there. The Sears Roebuck Company has a long history going all the way back into the 1800s. And it was the company that you could order anything from, especially when you lived out on the prairie. So you're living out on the prairie. The next town is a day's travel away. But you got the Sears Roebuck catalog for that year or that half a year or whatever the time frame was. And you could order everything in that, from a dress to underwear to a crock pot to a house. You could literally order an entire house ready to build.
Well, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And I did not expect that. However, where the heck is the romance in like checking boxes in a catalog, handing it to your mom?
Well, no. What you would do is you're not checking boxes in the catalog. They would just have the item numbers and stuff. And I used to go through there and circle. Oh, this would be cool. This would be cool. And then I'd wait and see what I got on at Christmas. But what it meant was that you weren't dealing with the lack of stock in the store. So if you went to a store in Christmas and the cool toy was gone, but you ordered it 2 months earlier already out of the catalog, you got it.
To go.
And these guys, the size of Sears, the retail power of Sears at this point is hard to overstate. They were so powerful. Them and JCPenney, they could really just, if they told a toy company, guess what? We got this many orders for the toy. You're going to deliver to us. They're going to cancel all the mom and pop shops. They're not going to get the toy.
Okay.
But any supply that is available is going to the big guys because you do not want to piss them off.
Right.
So yeah. And there is a link down below to a scan of the wish book, and it's set to the first page of the electronic toy section. So you just go through there. They've got the Atari 400 computer in there and everything else. It's quite cool. So, and our final story for 1979.
Yes, speaking about Christmas. The Christmas outlook is not so jolly.
Inflation woes are making retailers skittish. With oil prices rising, stay-at-home gifts are becoming more popular.
Because you can't afford to drive anywhere.
Exactly. A good thing for electronic games, but chip shortages may mean that not everyone gets the electronic games that they hope to get. Apparently, the increased use of chips in the car industry is eating up to 50% of the American chip manufacturing capacity and creating a shortage of product at the wholesale level.
Even for the Sears customers?
Possibly. We will find out. Whether this will translate into higher retail prices or a shortage at retail will have to be seen.
This is a real foreshadowing episode.
This is a real foreshadowing episode, but I mean, we're moving into Christmas. Everybody's trying to figure out what the business is going to be like at the end of this season. You've got a lot of companies over the last couple months that have introduced new products. We've got Texas Instruments coming in and all these different computer companies trying to cut out a slice of this business.
Yeah.
Christmas is going to make or break them.
Yeah. So, my dear listeners, stay excited.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, and these reports about the retail thing are not coming from the computer and video game publications. These are coming out of the U.S. News and World Report and the Associated Press. We're talking mainstream media is looking at this wondering what the heck is coming next. So, that ends our trip to 1979.
So, man, what the heck is coming next?
Well, let's find out in 1989. So you want to do a fake time travel sound here? Woo, woo. Whoa, whoa. Okay, I got nothing.
So, what's this instrument called where you have like those two, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know that weird thing that they used for all the science fiction shows in the 60s. Have no idea what it's called. Listeners, send us
one of those.
Tell us what that thing is called. Yeah, no, we don't. We don't. Okay, so welcome to November of 1989. So let's start off with some industry gossip and stories and news.
Okay, fair warning, it's gonna be a really depressing month.
Yeah. Well, at least the start is.
Yeah. Logotron splits up.
After a successful few years venturing into the games market, Logotron, a software developer with titles such as the puzzle game Soar and the 3D spectacle Archipelagos, has sold off its game development arm to its managing director, Michael Hayward. According to the Ace magazine, the new company will be called Logotron Entertainment Limited. Now, if you're wondering, Logotron, never heard of it, barely remember Zor and Archipelagos, well, this name wouldn't last long, with the company changing their name to Millennium, going into their first release, James Pond Undercover Agent. The Cambridge company would create many more classics such as James Pond 2 Robocod, Brutal Sports Football, and one of my personal favorites on the Amiga, Morph.
So it's James Pond.
James Pond, yes, he's a goldfish.
Okay.
Yeah. James Pond, there's a whole, there was James Pond, then there was James Pond 2 Robocod where he gets a metal body and then can extend up and has to save Santa Claus and these weird chocolate cookie things. It was a tie-in with an actual brand in England. It was weird.
They had fun programming it.
Yeah, and then there was James Pond Aquatic Games, which was sort of like an Olympic jump and run game thing. And I believe there was one more, and I'm blanking on what it was right now. But yeah.
Okay.
So, fun stuff. The company would later get bought up by Sony in 1997, would develop the Medieval series of games for the PlayStation, which just this last year got a remaster, and later get reorganized to work on the Killzone series before being dissolved in 2017. This company would also, interestingly enough, spawn the CyberLife Limited Company, makers of the Creatures line of virtual pet games in the late 90s.
It's really funny that during the 80s, every computer or electronics company has something Tron in its name, and then during the 90s, late 90s, it's something millennial, and afterwards it's something cyber. You know?
Yeah. These names do go through a certain Yeah, a certain phase. I mean, in late 70s, early 80s, you were Microsoft, Microprose, because they were talking about microcomputers. Then when that phrase kind of died out, nobody was saying microcomputer anymore, then, well, you had to find something else.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, so this Logotron thing, I'd never heard of the company before. When I saw the news, I was kind of like, well, I remember Zor being this puzzle game and stuff. And I was like, well, okay, is this interesting? And then I started digging deeper and deeper into what this company became, and I was quite surprised. And I thought, this is something for the show, because I've spent about 40 minutes researching it now, and I should pass that on.
So the time isn't wasted.
I hope not. If everybody just shut off in the middle of that Logotron story, yes, it was. But okay, hopefully not. So more corporate news.
Yes, Maxwell sells Microdeal.
In what could be a clear sign of the financial woes ahead, Robert Maxwell's Mirror Group sells off its software distribution arm, Microdeal, in order to help fund a £3 billion corporate expansion. How will this affect the group's software labels Mirrorsoft, Spectrum Holobyte, and the European distribution of Cinemaware titles? Well, not well. And the company's collapse starting at the end of 1991, will do the rest.
So what were those expansion plans that urgently needed a £3 billion but no distribution arm?
Well, it wasn't just for the software. Now, just to set the stage here a little bit, Robert Maxwell was a big-time media mogul. Started out with newspapers, the Mirror newspaper in England. It was basically a tabloid. So if you're from Germany, think Bild Zeitung, or if you're in the States, think National Enquirer, but with political pull. And, well, nowadays with Trump as president, the National Enquirer does have political pull, but that's another issue entirely. No, so the Mirror Group was this massive conglomerate of a ton of companies, and Maxwell had gotten into the software business with Mirrorsoft originally, and then also purchased Spectrum Holobyte in the US. And our faithful listeners will know that just a couple months ago we talked about how Nintendo was fighting with Mirrorsoft for the rights to Tetris, because Maxwell also had big links to the Soviet Union. Remember, this is all before the Soviet Union has collapsed. And so we have a fairly important and powerful company. Mirrorsoft is also, I believe they also control at this point ImageSoft, which is the company that is publishing games by the Bitmap brothers, for example, as well as titles for Sensible Software. So this is one of the reasons why Megalomania, the Sensible Software game, which is really, you could call it the first true RTS game with a tech tree before Civilization, or right around the same time, doesn't hit as big as it should, because it gets caught up with all of this and doesn't get the distribution that it needs. But that's another story for another time. So the big thing here is that Maxwell is selling off this software distribution network, which is a fairly big deal. It's a company that he had bought years earlier. And this £3 billion corporate expansion, as far as I can tell, and I've looked for references to it elsewhere, was probably just part of his scheme of moving money around and trying to avoid people noticing that he had already plundered the pension fund in order to keep his house of cards running.
He plundered the pension fund.
He plundered the pension fund, yes.
Well, that son of a gun.
Yep, and there was a lot
Mm.
of people were hurt by that.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people had suddenly virtually no retirement left. Now, curiously, in Commodore User Magazine that same month, they have a quick news item about a game Microdeal is hyping called Gold Runner 3D. Now, this is a sequel to a classic Atari ST upward-scrolling shoot-'em-up, and this new game will have amazing 3D graphics. It's going to be a full 3D game. The demise of Microdeal would see the game finally published in 1992 by Ocean, though, under the title of Epic.
And was it epic?
I felt so. Now, a lot of reviewers didn't care for the game. It wasn't necessarily always the best designed game in the world, and it came out after Wing Commander.
Okay.
And so, by contrast, because it was designed to be a non-shaded, filled-in polygon game, as opposed to Wing Commander, which used a sort of a jumpy bitmap mode, and was basically designed for 256 color VGA. It didn't look as impressive. Frame rate was somewhat wonky, and that first level, for some reason nobody understands, is just terrible. But it had this big epic storyline. It was basically a riff on Battlestar Galactica.
Okay.
And you had this tiny little gold fighter, and you had to basically keep saving the armada. And the nice thing was it combined both space combat and planet-based missions. So you actually were flying over this planet, blowing up targets and so forth. Sometimes you didn't know where the hell you were supposed to go. It had some problems, but it really was. It felt like this massive, massive game. I loved the hell out of it back on the Amiga. But then again, that may have just been me developing a coping mechanism to come to terms with the fact that we did not have a version of Wing Commander for the Amiga at that point. And when we did get one, it kind of sucked. So yes, that's just the sad reality of it, of being an Amiga user in the early 90s. Go figure. But yeah, so this is one of those interesting little developments where a game just gets pushed off, publisher's suddenly gone, and it has to be reinvented and shows up someplace else.
And this is always a good sign of quality. Yeah.
Not always. Sometimes it's just a sign that it's going to be late. That happens too. So, okay. And sticking with corporate news.
Yes, Epix exits the computer gaming business.
One of the oldest computer game companies has abandoned home computers. Now, remember, in our very first episode, we talked about the founding of Epix, back when it was still called Automated Simulations. And Epix, just months after seeing their internally developed handheld, the Lynx, launched, has announced massive layoffs and a change of direction. They will only develop for consoles and handhelds going forward. This was just a ruse, actually, though, for the reality that the Tramiel's Atari had withheld payments due for Lynx hardware and software development, forcing Epix into Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
So why did Tramiel withhold those payments?
Because that's what the Tramiels always did.
Withholding payments?
Oh, yeah, they were infamous for this. They
Okay.
would withhold payments, then wait until you couldn't do anything anymore, then either offer you a small amount just to keep you afloat, or they would...
Take your product and let you go broke.
Or they would just buy you up for
that.
debt. They're debentures. They were famous for
vampires.
using debentures to try to purchase things, yes. Yeah,
And when they were famous for
ruthless.
it, so why did Epix like cooperate with those?
Well, because
Vultures.
Epix was under a really, really poor management team for
Okay.
a long time. They had never really figured out why their software business had worked. They had no backup for moving from the 8-bit Commodore 64 to other systems. They never
Okay.
really had a home on any other system other than the C64.
Okay.
When that market was gone, they were deep into becoming a hardware developer. They brought in this Lynx project, the Handy project. They brought in a bunch of guys, amazing designers, a lot of the people who had worked on the Amiga originally. And the project basically was too big for the company, especially at a time when their software sales revenues were just disappearing.
Yeah.
And we talked about them just a few months ago, how they had bought up the rights to a bunch of European games, and they were trying to do the same thing Microprose was, which was to refocus on action-oriented, almost console-like experiences for home computers in order to keep that business model going. And it just wasn't, apparently it wasn't enough. And so now they're abandoning the home computer market altogether, the only place where they had any success. But by 89, the C64, what market share it had as the kids' gaming computer has been usurped by the NES. And so
bye-bye Epics.
Not quite. They're going to sort of meander on until 1993, but
did they do anything in
a
between
couple
those
of
4 years?
a couple of games for the Lynx,
which didn't really take off.
Which didn't really take off. They manage their rights here and there. A couple of their older titles get revisions or ports to newer systems, but that's pretty much it. And they ultimately will just disappear, and the portfolio of games, California games, summer games, and so forth, that they get passed around from company to company for the next 30 years. I mean, somebody still has the rights. You still see it on compilations and on systems like the C64 Mini. The Epix games still show up because those rights are still sitting someplace. But yeah, it's a sad tale for a company that, you know, started out really, really strong back in 79.
So 10 years.
Well, 78 actually. Thanksgiving, I wanted to say Turkey Day. Thanksgiving of 78. So they last 11 years until the bankruptcy. Yeah. Go figure. And our last bit of company news. Yeah, we'll make it 10 years. We got this. Yeah.
Go for it. 10 years later.
I can't believe we're still doing this.
Yes.
Not only have we been doing this for 10 goddamn years, but now I got an accent. I don't even know where it came from. Okay.
Since why I finally listened to one of those episodes, you know, single. Anyway, Polarware gets bought by Merit Software.
Venerable early Apple II developer Penguin Software, later renamed Polarware, best known for their early graphics software for the system, have finally lost their independence and have been bought by a Texas investment company. Merit Software would develop quite a few titles over the years, also expanding into Europe with the purchase of Zeppelin Software, but the early spirit of Penguin was no more. And I know Penguin was not what you would call a games developer, but a lot of the software they developed, the graphics software, sound software, and so forth, was the foundation for a lot of games on the Apple II. And a lot of people who got their start either with their software or at the company would later go on to bigger things. So I thought it would at least be nice to acknowledge this moment for the demise of Penguin Software.
Speaking of demise, the Sam Coupé gets presented to the press.
Presented.
What did I
Not
say?
president. No, it gets presented to the press.
I don't know why is that
president. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Believe me, everybody's got that on the brain
of
right
Mike
now.
Pompeo. I still
Yeah.
Mind he's gonna come. Well, anyhow,
okay.
This Sam Coupé gets presented to the press.
So, back to England, and after countless delays and changes in plans, the final and only version of the Sam Coupé is presented to the public on September 12th. Further production delays would push release of the machine to December, missing out on the lucrative and very vital Christmas season, sealing the machine's fate.
So, since it was published eventually...
Not published, this is a computer. So
since it came to the market eventually...
Yes.
Did it find any buyers?
Well, okay, as a small recap, we've talked about the Sam Coupé a few times over the last year. It was a spiritual successor to the Spectrum Sinclair Spectrum. It was an 8-bit computer. It was supposed to be backwards compatible with the Spectrum, and that turned out to be very, very limited in its usability. It was supposed to be a machine that was high-end enough, but at the same time cheap enough to be interesting to the regular standard middle working class English consumer.
So this sounds pretty good, actually.
It should have been, with the exception of the fact that Commodore was bringing down the price of the Amiga 500.
Okay.
The Atari ST was already basically at super, super low prices. And they already had a mountain of software available to them. Had the Sam Coupe truly had 100% backwards compatibility with the Spectrum and the Spectrum 128K models, then this would have been true because it would have also had the advantage of a massive software library. As it stands at the end, they got very, very little software support relative to the other systems. The delay meant that they missed the first big Christmas by 1991. They just really can't compete because every year the other systems are getting cheaper. They needed that first Christmas to even stand a chance. And also, you can't really state this strongly enough, with the exception of England and Spain, nobody, and well, behind the Iron Curtain, which didn't really matter, with the exception of England and Spain, nobody really cared that much for the Sinclair Spectrum. It was a system that had those two markets, and they were significant markets, but they weren't big enough at this point to really justify high-end production values in software. And I think that there was really no way that you were going to be able to square this circle. You either had to release a true 16-bit system with 16-bit graphics, something akin to what we've been seeing for the Spectrum Next, which is a crowd-funded project to create a system that sort of runs along the lines of the original Spectrum, but has a lot of improvements like avoiding color clash and things like that. So, no, this was just not going to happen, I don't think. It was a bad idea from the get-go, and it wasn't going to get better with these delays. So, yeah, sad but true, but it's over for the Sam Coupe. By this time next year, the company will be no more. But that is something that we will talk about at the appropriate time.
And in like every podcast, in like every episode, some kind of this is just amazing. And I promise you guys, we're not doing this on purpose. We might enjoy it a bit, but we're not doing this on purpose. Anyhow, talking
about something upbeat.
Yeah, talking about something upbeat, something nice and fuzzy. Oswald is taking Danish TV by storm and talking about ripping off people. There you go.
It's not ripping anybody off.
Oh, they are surely not paying like $5 a minute for calling those guys.
No. Well, okay. Now, the latest entry into the play video games on a TV show by barking orders over the phone genre is Oswald, a bear jumping around from iceberg to iceberg. Now, this game is powered by an Amigo, and it would later get a commercial release as well as a sequel.
Hugo.
Hugo would be a little bit later. The genre would hit its peak with Hugo, but that's still a couple years off. Now, this is a much simpler game than Hugo. It doesn't have the sort of run into the horizon effect that Hugo had. This is far more simplistic of basically the sprite jumping back and forth. And and of course it had limited commercial success due to the fact that it was coming off of Danish TV, and they didn't franchise it the same way that Hugo gets franchised a few years later.
I really remember Hugo back when I was a child, being at my grandma. The TV was running in the afternoon, and there was this, I don't know what it was, talk show-ish thingy, and there were people could actually call, pay $5 for a call, and play Hugo, and it would be so unfair. I mean, they always lose. No one ever won.
Of course not. And the best part is they later released Hugo on the home computers.
And I've played that as well. It was like 6 floppy disks for like 4 levels or something.
That could be. But remember, it's because there was a massive amount of animation and graphics in that game.
And the sound was amazing. It came right out of my tower PC. Like,
well, see, you played the DOS,
DOS version.
No. The proper version is the Amiga version. That's the one to play. The Commodore 64 port is surprisingly good.
Okay.
I mean, really, they did a great job of getting those 3D effects working, much better than they did on Narco Police. But that's another issue for another time. We don't need to go into the individual
So many
games.
other issues for
There's
other
so
times.
many other things to talk about. So
Let's move on.
let's go from
Yeah.
computer gaming to...
The console market. Lucasfilm Games is it's one company. Lucasfilm Games is going console.
The rise of the console as a new place to play continues to worry hardcore PC gamers, especially those at Computer Gaming World magazine. The editorial this month is an alarmist piece about the end of real gaming.
Master Race, boo.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you really have to read it. The link's down below. This thing is just, wow. It's whiny bitch time. So, Lucasfilm, an industry stalwart, has just announced the establishment of a console development division to be headed by Greg Hammond, previously of Broderbund. Greg would go on to work on titles such as Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe, The Secret of Monkey Island, Night Shift, and Loom at LucasArts before leaving the studio, all computer titles. But in 1990, we would see the first Lucasfilm games to hit a console. And I'm not counting the Atari 8-bit ports to the XE of Ball Blazer and games like that. Now, Maniac Mansion on the NES was the first one. Other ports would follow with Loom on the TurboGrafx 16 CD and Monkey Island on the Sega CD in the following years. So, yes, LucasArts, Lucasfilm would go on to do a whole bunch of console games, the Rogue Squadron games and so forth, obviously. But the fact that they've announced has really kind of scared Computer Gaming World, because these guys were doing point-and-click adventures. These guys were doing big, fancy flight sims. Having them leave, or even worse, bringing that level of complexity to a console would, I think, it scares them, because it means that their whole argument that these are simplified systems that can't play complex story-based games goes flying out the window.
Yeah.
And that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of losing
change.
that.
Yeah.
Yes. But so it's a fun little bit of news, and to see how far back this shift at Lucasfilm goes.
And I just like that every now and then some editor is like bitching about changes in the industry, and
It's what editors do, and they have to make their readers feel like they know more than the next guy.
we don't know what's going to happen, so let's bitch about things changing.
And then assholes like us come along 30 years later, and they're like, oh, weren't they dumb back then? Ha, ha, ha.
Exactly.
Oh.
So,
Hindsight's a wonderful
talking about dumb stuff. Mega Drive peripherals are on the horizon.
So, we talked a few months ago about the announced Sega modem for the Genesis/Mega Drive that would only get released in Japan. Now there is talk of keyboards and graphic tablets. The Genesis would become notorious for being a system with a lot of add-ons, but sadly the keyboard would be limited to an X-Band exclusive, sold apparently by mail order in the US and at retail in Brazil. The graphic tablet, on the other hand, which was shown in some press materials and apparently a working prototype does exist, would probably have been based on a similar graphic tablet launch for Sega's earlier SG-1000 console in Japan.
So why wasn't the keyboard X-Band exclusive?
Well, because there were no games that required a keyboard.
So you just needed to chat with people.
You needed it to chat with people and to send messages. So there was
Except
no
for
point...
Brazil, where everyone obviously needed a keyboard.
Well, I'm just guessing in Brazil, mail order, if the Brazilian postal service back then was anything like the Argentine postal service I grew up with, you didn't send shit by mail because it wasn't going to get there, because the mailman would just decide, ooh, this is something I need. You could not trust the mail to deliver. So this is where sending it by mail or selling it by mail just wouldn't be an option. It would have to go through retail. Yeah.
Okay.
Also, yeah, it's the Brazilian Genesis / Master System markets were very, very different creatures. Lasted a lot longer, and in many ways were more sophisticated than the North American ones, just because of the type of product and the type of uses they found for the hardware. Well, they're still selling this stuff today.
For what?
For gaming.
Okay.
I mean, if let's face it, it's not a country with a massive rich population, and at the same time they have massive restrictions on the import of non-nationally produced products.
Okay.
So importing a game console costs a fortune down there, still to this day. And so that means if you're going to play something, it's got to be manufactured in country. So, yeah. There you go. And on to the next fun story about consoles.
Yeah, and producing stuff in country. Entrepreneurs are picking up NEC's slack.
After last month's published warning from NEC about grey import PC Engine consoles in the UK, an entrepreneurial group called Mention and Active Sales and Marketing are launching the PC Engine Plus in the UK. The PC Engine Plus, according to Ace Magazine, is a professionally modified Japanese PC engine that won't have many of the flaws normally associated with grey imports, such as laggy PAL converters and faulty power supplies and blocked expansion ports.
So first of all, I like that they were advertised with, we are not having many of the flaws normally existing.
Well, this is not there on the slogan,
wording.
but they were promising, to give you an actual guarantee that you could return it and stuff. And they were trying to do it. You have to remember, at this point, if you're grey importing a console from Japan, it's some dude at a little local shop who bought 10 of them from some guy coming over in an airplane, and he's doing the job himself with a soldering iron in the back room.
I mean, I'm wondering in there, and this is the other thing, when there are actually companies being founded that sell the PC engine, why doesn't NEC do it like themselves?
Well, NEC at this point has had a lot of success in Japan with their system.
And this is all they wanted to achieve.
Well, they've also had a lot of success with computers in Japan. And we've talked about in the 79 episodes, or the 79 segments, how NEC had tried to launch some stuff in the States to less than stellar success. Remember, the computer industry in Japan is a very different beast to North America at this point.
Right.
And so they've just launched their system in the US, the TurboGrafx 16.
Yeah.
And they're probably waiting to see. Remember also, Europe is not a console place. There is no console that is controlling the market. The NES has failed to take off in Europe. The Sega Master System is a very, very poor second cousin. It's all about home computers. So a launch in Europe means you've got to go through a whole bunch of different countries. There's no European Union at this point. So you have to do imports and everything to each individual country.
Well, or you just start with the UK.
You could start with the UK, but even then, everybody across Europe is grey importing this system right now. There's every month in the German magazines, they're also reviewing grey imported PC Engine games. Everybody wants this magical machine that can do all this cool stuff. It's by far the most technically, or at least graphically, advanced system on the market. But I don't think NEC has the drive, interest, or expertise to launch a product like this. And the relative failure of the TurboGrafx 16 in the United States is proof of this. They really don't know what the hell they're doing outside of Japan. And, well, they may just be delaying because of something else they've got on the horizon.
Yes, maybe. The PC Engine 2 is coming.
Nothing but a quick sketch and some basic specs are known as of press time, but CVG Magazine got the scoop faxed in from Japan. The design sketches clearly the machine later known as the PC Engine Super Graphics. While the new system would boast a massive speed and RAM boost as well as some stronger graphic hardware, it was still backward compatible with the existing TurboGrafx 16 library, and only 5 titles would be released for the system, all on HuCards.
So absolutely no need to buy the PC Engine 2.
Well, at the time it was launched, you didn't know they were only going to have 5 games.
Well, this is, again, us
And you could
30
still
years
play
later.
all of your HuCards. But, well, I mean, it doesn't take you very long to figure out that the 5 games are all that's coming out. I mean, you'd hope that they would have a little bit more than that on the horizon, but they didn't. There were, and you could plug in the CD add-on to this thing for the regular PC Engine, but they never released any CD games for it.
Well,
So the system was, in that regard, a failure, even though it really could do some spectacular stuff. The system would only see release in Japan and France, and quickly be discontinued after only selling 75,000 units.
okay, so they basically were like, screw the one thing that everyone wants to have, and this is successful, and bring out something else that no one gives a damn about.
My
Well, you
personal
don't know this
feeling
in
after
advance,
doing
sure.
a little bit of research on this and just looking at the market, they had just launched the regular TurboGrafx in the US.
Yeah.
They had launched this years before in Japan. So the Japanese market would have been ready for a follow-up. But the
It wasn't.
US market wasn't. The European market, the fact that they launched this in France is kind of weird. It's like, well, let's try this out. And it would have made sense to bring it to Europe where there was no PC Engine market yet.
Yeah.
That would have been a market you could have sold on. And instead, they decided not to do anything with it. And the US market was about to enter the 16-bit wars properly. First with TurboGrafx 16 versus Genesis, and a couple years later the Super Nintendo. But I think it was just the Super Nintendo was on the horizon, and I don't think that they really felt they could go against it, or they couldn't get enough third parties to support the system for that to happen.
Okay.
So either which way, it's a footnote in history, and wouldn't be the last time NEC tried a console. We will see them again, but it should have been. So, all right. And moving on to arcades, but not moving away from the PC Engine.
Yes, the PC Engine-based arcade hardware is shown off.
It looks like NEC has decided to jump on the put a console in arcade cabinet trend. The machines talked about by CVG magazine seem to be the ones created by United Amusements under license by NEC. The whole setup looks to be somewhat jerry-rigged PC Engine to JAMA harness. So what they've done is they've taken a regular PC Engine with regular HuCards, and they've rewired the video and controller outputs so that they can plug into a standard JAMA harness. Now, JAMA harness is the arcade standard that allows you to put in any arcade motherboard into almost any arcade cabinet. So it's a standardized video output, standardized monitor configuration, and standardized controller output. Okay. So you can interchange games from different manufacturers.
And did they have any special games on them? Because why the hell would you have to go to a arcade when you have your own PC Engine?
Well, okay, and now as a child of Europe who is not familiar with the arcade scene, the idea of putting console games into an arcade cabinet, especially multiple console games into one single cabinet, was not something new. That was actually a very established idea at this point. The Nintendo had done this with the NES with the Play 10 Choice, or Play Choice 10. Okay. I have to look that up again. Their system was basically a cabinet monitor, and they would put 10 NES games into it, you would throw in money and that would give you either a limited number of lives or a limited amount of time to play the game.
Okay.
And now these were usually slightly modified versions of the game that would run because you need to restrict the lives or time.
Okay.
Which the normal home game wouldn't have the same restrictions. But what this did was, number one, it was great advertising. Number two, it was much cheaper than a normal PCB board with much more powerful hardware. And it allowed kids to test games more extensively than they otherwise could. These are not the days when you could download a demo. You couldn't just download a demo of a cartridge game. You had to fork over $60, $70 and then hope this thing was okay. That's a problem. That is a big problem. But if I can go into the arcade and try out Double Dragon 2 on the NES before purchasing it, that's worth my 50 cents.
Okay.
And so this is what they would do. Sega would do it again later with, I believe, the Mega Play system. And this was an attempt to do it. But again, we see how NEC isn't really engaging. They're letting a third party do this.
Yes.
They're not providing real proper hardware. It's all jerry-rigged stuff. The pictures of this really do look janky. And you just have this feeling of they didn't really know if they wanted to do it or not. It's,
Let's
take
give it
a
a
dump
try.
or get off the pot. And NEC doesn't really seem to be going that extra mile.
To take a dump.
Yeah. They're not producing anything is what I'm trying to say here. It's an old saying that I'm slightly editing for niceness on the podcast, okay? Work with me here.
Okay.
Okay. So, and our last bit of news for
throw in the
1989.
Capcom gets on the reusable arcade board bandwagon.
Following last month's news about the Sega System 24, which tried to cut costs by allowing arcade operators to update the games on their machines with floppy disks, Capcom is meeting them halfway with a standard hardware but interchangeable ROM boards with new games.
Okay.
The CP system would give us classics like Ghouls and Ghosts, Forgotten Worlds, Strider, Magic Sword, Street Fighter II, Three Wonders, and Captain Commando. Oh, and the pretty abysmal Pang 3. But pretty much everything that comes off the CPC system board is an automatic classic.
Okay. Being shipped as chips.
Not as chips. I mean, it was a board, a fairly large board of chips, but they're ROM chips. So it's what you would find in a game cartridge, only without the plastic case around it. And you just plug these into the board. Now, some of these later games would end up, I think, getting some an extra audio chip or something added to them. But for the most part, you were still running the same CPUs and everything else off the motherboard, just changing out the boards. And they would do this, they would get the CPC system too, and I believe a 3 and maybe even a 4, but don't quote me on the 4. But we had at least CPS system 2 and 3. 2 is what gives us things like Street Fighter Alpha later on, and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the new challengers, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
It's fun stuff. But what it really means is that for less money, you can trade out the games faster.
Well, it makes sense. You don't have to throw away the entire system.
You don't have to throw away the entire system. And it really made going to the arcades more and more fun. But what it also meant was you started to recognize the hardware capabilities. I still remember as a kid trying to identify, oh, wait, this is the same cabinet as 2 weeks ago. Now it's got a different game in it. And you started to realize what each company's hardware was capable of.
Yeah.
And that's also informed the design. I mean, Data East would have their own board, which was never as good as the Capcom stuff or the Sega stuff, but they got very creative with some of the games. And it was you got a feel for the companies, and you almost could say, okay, this is this company, even if you didn't know who was designing the game.
Well, and at the same time, you surely developed a preference for some companies and a dislike for some others.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't think it was ever really
Midwest
a
fans.
dislike. It was just more of a, you realize who you gelled with better. Yeah.
Yeah.
And at home, you had the same thing. Nobody was going to confuse an NES with a Sega Genesis.
Yeah.
Even without seeing the system or the controller, you could just tell from the graphics what was one system and what was the other. Same thing later between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. And these boards were basically just the same thing, only on steroids. Okay. Yeah. So, okay, that finishes off our trip to 1989. Let's turn on the time machine and go to November of 1999. Welcome to November of 1999.
I was just about to make a swish sound.
Please make your swish sound.
Swish. And there you go.
Are you happy now?
Yeah, totally.
Good.
No, you have to say welcome to 1999. You're totally
Welcome
gonna cut this out,
to
don't you?
1999. Yay! Swish. Okay.
All right. Let's be honest. Not honest. Let's be
Serious?
thanks. It's late.
It's very late.
It was
It's
a
very
damn
late.
long day.
Okay, yeah, it's a very
Yeah.
late day. So, okay, let's get on to some company news.
For change, Atari Games gets renamed to Midway Games West.
Midway, which purchased Atari Games in 1996, finally renames the venerable arcade company to Midway Games West to avoid confusion in the marketplace.
And put the coffin into the Atari name.
The coffin?
Brand.
No,
The-
put
the
the
nail.
nail in the coffin of the Atari Games brand.
It was a long day. Did I say
Okay.
they put the coffin in the brand?
It puts the lotion in the basket. No, okay. So the important thing here to remember is that for almost 20 years at this point, we've had two Ataris, or 15 years at this point, we've had two Ataris.
Yeah, and it was
There
hella
was
confusing.
Atari, the home division, the ones that the Tramiels bought and used to make home computers and consoles. And we've had now Atari Games, which has been going continuously making arcade games. And a lot of big arcade hits. And at this point, they're still making games like, for example, Gauntlet Legends. They're making Area 51. And, well, after the 1996 purchase by Midway, this is basically where the Atari arcade brand, the original Atari, because remember, the company started as an arcade company, this is when it finally disappears. Yeah. It doesn't die. The offices stay open. They're still doing research. They're still doing development. But the name is gone. And it's kind of sad. So, every company dies.
We need a trumpet now. Trumpet playing. Sad tune.
Yeah.
And while we are searching for a trumpet player, again, if any of your listeners wants to play a sad tune, just send it to us. We will listen to it. Until then, Interplay is going to the movies.
Film developer and publisher Interplay has opened a division of the company to produce films based off of some of its hit gaming properties, such as Fallout, Descent, and Redneck Rampage.
Redneck Rampage?
Redneck Rampage was a build engine. That was the Duke Nukem engine,
Yeah.
based first-person shooter where you were a bunch of rednecks. And there were space aliens and all sorts of stuff. It was actually a very funny, nonsensical game.
So like
yes.
cowboys and dinosaurs versus aliens.
Yeah, more like something not depressing.
All right.
But yeah, so they tried their hand at this, at turning their properties into films, which Interplay was holding on to a lot of cool properties. Wasteland would have been an amazing movie if you did it right. but unfortunately, yeah, it just was not going to happen under these circumstances. The company was already on very, very thin ice, and this feels less like a serious attempt to go multimedia than it just felt like a way to quickly sell off some movie rights to get some money to keep the company going. So,
It's like a desperate attempt.
A very desperate attempt to keep everything afloat and generate some quick cash.
It didn't work, did it? No.
It did not work. We have not yet seen a Fallout movie, so sadly. But
I really would have liked to see Redneck Rampage.
Dude, you can still go and play Redneck Rampage. The game is still out there.
I don't want to play it. I want to see it.
You want to see it?
It's like one of those movies where you want
It's
to
called
hang
a
out
Let's
with a couple.
Play. You can watch Redneck Rampage. YouTube makes it possible. As Charlie Brooker predicted last month,
But
it is possible.
Watching a bad movie attitude where you get together with a couple of friends and you get a little bit boosted up and then you watch like Matt Cheaty or something.
We can sit down and watch. What's the name of it? There's a movie. Tucker and Dale versus Evil. It's as close to Redneck Rampage the movie as you're going to get.
We should make a Tucker and Dale versus Evil movie and send your wife and my girlfriend somewhere else.
You mean a movie night? Yes,
basically.
Yes. We would have to send them someplace else because they're not sitting through that.
No.
I tried getting her to sit through Meet the Feebles. That wasn't going to happen. So, yeah. I need to watch Meet the Feebles again. It's been too many years. Well, it's been 3 years. But still, it's been too many years. Yeah,
okay.
definitely need to watch that again.
Yeah.
You've seen it, right?
No, I haven't.
You haven't seen Meet the Feebles?
I haven't seen a whole lot of the crap you like to
Meet
watch.
the Feebles.
You kind of forget there are more than... Are there more than 10 years between the two of us?
When were you born?
1990.
Yeah, there's 14-year difference between us.
And this makes a difference.
Poor sod. Okay.
Well, I have more years to come than you, so...
Oh, please.
Most likely...
I plan on living forever. I'm going to be the 90-year-old...
Who wants to live forever? And no...
Who dares to love forever?
I really shouldn't listen to this podcast, man.
No, the Queen song. Who wants to live forever?
There you go.
Who dares to love forever?
Really?
Forever is our today.
Where's the connection between the two of them?
Well, it's because it's the movie Highlander.
Yeah.
It's not just about living forever, but you also have to keep those relationships going. One of the big
because
things in
everyone
the
around
movies-
you just dies and you build up new relationships and you just at some point
Well,
say
that's
screw people.
the whole... Didn't you ever watch that movie? You've
When
never
was
seen
I born?
Highlander?
Man, when was I born?
It doesn't
There
matter.
you
That
go.
would be like saying...
No,
Dude, I wasn't born when Citizen Kane came out, but that hasn't stopped me from watching it.
Yeah.
A Face in the Crowd. 12 Angry Men.
Absolutely.
Network. Okay, I was
Exists.
alive when Network came out, but just barely.
He was fighting for survival.
Oh, jeez. Okay, let's focus back on this. We've lost everybody. If it wasn't my singing that did it, this did it. So,
Sure.
okay.
Moving on.
Moving on.
Wait, let me...
Yeah. Find your inner peace. You know,
Find my
your
inner peace.
acting chops here. Okay, yes. Oh.
We are sober, everyone, and we are not baked. Just saying.
Yeah, no. Unlike last
This
month,
is
there's
our-
no bottle of wine sitting here. Okay,
No.
go for it.
And it's also not waiting downstairs. Anyway, Hasbro buys Wizards of the Coast.
The makers of Magic the Gathering, Pokemon trading cards, and owners of the Dungeons and Dragons brand have been bought by toy maker Hasbro. So this was a fairly big deal because, like we just talked about last month, D&D 3rd edition just came out. Pokemon trading cards are still massive.
Oh yeah, they were.
Magic was still big, but wasn't as big as it had been. But the fact that Hasbro bought them up really showed that, or at least we hoped there was going to be big synergies. because you also had, I believe, Hasbro Interactive already at this point. So we're thinking, okay, all of this is going to be under one big roof. It's going to be one big synergy, and nothing really ever came of it. It just kind of was like, okay, Hasbro's making the money now.
Business as usual, right?
Business as usual. I mean, it didn't harm, especially the D&D brand. The D&D brand was very, very strong in these years. 4th edition, 5th edition came out. I mean, they have shepherded that property through very, very well. Hasbro has known when to stay the hell away from it.
And this is a good thing to know.
This is true. Now, I mean, I'm guessing that the D&D movie had already been planned before that disaster, but they were at least cool enough to see future D&D movies to fruition. So the straight to DVD ones, they look terrible, but I still like them. So it's all good. Something good did come out of that. And there's no Wayans brother in any of the sequels, which is a huge plus. So
Definitely. Speaking of a huge minus, 3DFX is in trouble.
With the arrival of the GeForce line of cards, 3DFX seems to be losing its hegemony on the 3D accelerator market. PC Player magazine reports that 3DFX has delayed the Voodoo 4 chipset, missing the important Christmas holiday season. The head of the company, Greg Ballard, is counting on a March 2000 release of the technology, with the press getting test units before the end of the year. Apparently, the problems arise from an incompatibility with Microsoft's Web TV program, causing problems with the Voodoo 3500 cards. Microsoft has also bulked, according to PC Zone magazine, to include DirectX support for 3DFX's T-Buffer technology. Subtle suggestion that they should give up Voodoo for Direct3D?
Yes.
Very much so. So for those of you with a refresher necessary, 3DFX was one of the four trailblazers in the 3D acceleration card market for PCs. They had their own API, their own instruction set called the Voodoo driver, and this wasn't uncommon at the time, but with the rise of DirectX and especially Direct3D, Microsoft was basically saying, everybody get in line, follow us, make this a standard, and we don't have to fight over compatibility anymore.
Right.
Because more people playing on PCs means more copies of Windows sold. And Microsoft was ultimately right. Even though companies like 3DFX, which I stayed loyal to for probably a little bit too long, I tend to do that, I seem to realize with technology. They were coming up with some very interesting tech. The only problem is, because it was proprietary, because other people weren't going to be doing it, it just meant for developers, you had to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And having one standardized Direct3D API that all cards were compatible with really meant that you could suddenly get the most out of the cards, because they weren't messing around with stuff that wasn't going to be in the API. They could focus on faster performance and better resolutions and so forth.
Well, and you can really specialize in those API language, you know?
That's the thing. And also, the card developers don't have to rewrite the API. They don't have to be in the software business as much.
Yeah, just use the same code and it just works.
And it just works. It was plug and play. And it's kind of weird that the web TV thing is what kills it. But this was a big movement at the time to add TV tuner cards to your 3D accelerator card. I mean, this is also the days of the .com boom. And I still remember that I set up a profile on my Windows 98 machine where when I loaded it up, it was just for checking my stocks. I was a student at the time. It was like $200 in stock that I was moving around. But I had like 4 windows that would open automatically in Windows. And I had my TV tuner in one corner with CNBC, the stock market news in one corner.
And you felt all brokerage until you felt pretty brokish.
I didn't lose any money, although I did miss out on the trade of the century. And it was Christmas of 98, I believe.
Well, you could basically
when-
just short the entire market and you're good to go.
I believe it was 98. It was the 97 or 98. It was probably 98. It was the first year of the N64.
Oh.
And I was looking at all the stock information, and I was certain I should buy Acclaim because they were the only ones making violent games for the N64 that season. They had Mortal Kombat Gold and Turok. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, they're going to sell a ton of games because nobody else is going to get that valuable market of little boys who want to see blood and guts. And sure enough, Acclaim stock right after Christmas went up, tripled. I could have made a killing.
Instead,
I was too much of a pansy, and I held on to Microsoft.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So
well,
go figure.
actually, if you waited until today.
If I had waited until today, yes,
But this is the thing.
Who's patient enough for that?
Exactly. People think, hey, it's stocks. I need to make a big profit.
Yeah. So, okay.
Really short time.
But now,
Anyway.
moving away from company troubles to some hardcore console numbers.
And let's celebrate. Dreamcast US launch numbers revealed, and they are amazing.
Sega's mega push seems to have worked. Just shy of $98 million worth of Dreamcast hardware was sold on day one of the system's launch in North America. 15,000 retailers, with 400 of them doing midnight sale events, and $100 million marketing push has made the Dreamcast launch the best first day launch in console history.
I have absolutely no idea why anyone should buy a console on the launch date.
Well, remember, this was also a launch that was accompanied by, I believe, 17 games. And you had Soul Calibur was one of them. And it was just the hype. I remember I went out drinking the night the Dreamcast came out and walked by
Just
a
to
shop
stop yourself
that
from buying
was
one.
selling the Dreamcast.
And what happened?
And there was a massive group of people outside the
stumbled
store,
by them.
and they
Alright.
had a stand and they were playing music. It was like a party for the launch of this thing, and people felt like they were part of this historic event.
And what did you feel, my friend?
A very light buzz. Yeah, I
was
was feeling
totally
good at
nauseous.
that moment. No. It was a light buzz. I was in college, I was having a good time. It was okay. It was okay. But I remember walking by. It was a Rhino video game store in Gainesville, Florida. Huh. So yeah. I walked by there on the midnight launch. Yeah, of the Dreamcast.
Little THE.
Yeah, and I remember they had the demo unit up, and Soul Calibur was running, and it looked phenomenal. Yeah.
So, but did it sell phenomenal? Except for day one.
It sold really well on day one. Sega projected first-year sales of 1 million units in North America and 1.5 million by March 31st of 2000. They would hit the 1 million mark by January of 2000 and moved a March goal up to 2 million units.
Well, this is actually pretty amazing. So I wonder what happened to them. I mean, when the console takes off so well, why didn't the game developers jump on the wagon and develop just for Dreamcast? Totally forget about PS2.
Well, I mean, North America's not the only part of this.
Yeah.
There's also the other
Europe
side of
market.
the pond.
Yes, Dreamcast also launches in Europe.
Sega breaks records in Europe with an estimated 200,000 consoles sold on the first weekend across Europe. Their goal of selling out 1 million units within 6 months seems very much within their reach. 20,000 units were sold just in Spain. So
Europe
the European
as
launch, especially considering how non-console heavy Europe is, even at this point, these are astounding numbers.
So the It's Thinking campaign finally paid off.
The It's Thinking campaign really seems to have
Not
struck
hurt
a
so
chord.
much. Yeah.
And continue with Sega News.
Yeah, they are also talking big about online gaming.
And funny enough, Sega of Japan chairman and CEO Isao Okawa, sorry I killed that I'm sure, has talked to arcade industry members about how Sega is not ignoring arcades. Part of this, quote, not ignoring, is that they are building strategic partnerships with AT&T to enter the online gaming market in a big, bad way. How this will actually be implemented in an arcade setting isn't clear, but the mentions that they will actually launch a new IPO for a new company called Sega.com to develop this new online capability.
So basically, he said nothing.
No, he said that they were going to launch an IPO with a company that had .com in the title.
Oh, this is a good sign.
Like you were mentioning earlier about how in the 70s you had to have a Tron in there, or in the 80s you had to have a Tron in there and so forth. At this point, you had to have a .com in the name.
Okay.
Because this is the height of the .com boom. And so Sega is hoping to raise some capital with this new IPO.
Oh, it's got .com.
It never happened.
Let's give it money.
It never happened. And the whole idea that we're going to go online in the arcade is... there are some experiments with this that happen. The Golden Tee Golf Series is probably the most prominent. But yeah, this is all just pipe dreams that are never going to amount to anything. But you can see, I mean, we've talked the last few months that despite this launch in the States, Sega is hurting in Japan. Sega is hurting in a big, bad way. And this just reeks of desperation move, in my opinion. And it really is just my opinion. I have no inside scoop on this. But yeah, this just looks like, what the hell? So, and... speaking of what the hell and the demise of Sega...
Yeah, the details of the PS2 are revealed.
Last month we talked about how the first tidbits about the PS2 got revealed. Well, this month there are a ton of facts and figures. The Japanese launch, March 4th, 2000. So within spitting distance of the Dreamcast North America launch. Japanese launch price will be $390, $299 in the US, and a buttload of processing power. Oh, and a little thing called a DVD drive will be included as well. Sony talks about its online capabilities that would only be available through an optional add-on. The add-on would be released a year after the Japanese launch and would have both Ethernet and hard drive connections. But the promised Sony network service was a no-go. The promise of being able to buy and download games never materialized, and the handful of titles that did support online play had to be played over publisher or third-party run servers. So, we know...
Well, this sounds so negative.
Well, the online thing sounds negative. And the price, compared to the $199 price of the Dreamcast, seems high. But $299... still makes it the cheapest DVD player on the market.
Right.
And as we will see, that processing power, once they show the demo of Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation 2 running, all bets are off.
I'm just wondering, why can this thing be so cheap when... And also the Dreamcast be so cheap, you know, when a standard DVD player, yes... new technology, but still, when a standard DVD player was way more expensive than those gaming consoles that could do way more.
Well, you have to remember that the DVD player is not just about the hardware that's included, even though that is a major factor that you need some processing power to encode the video signal and the audio signal. But what you really need in the DVD player is the license to build the DVD player.
But Sony needed the license as well.
No,
except
Sony
when
is
they
basically the owner of the license.
Okay, there you go.
So, and also Sony is so big that they're taking a bath on this. But remember, if you're a DVD manufacturer, you're not getting a cut of the license fee that every film publisher has to pay to publish a DVD.
Okay.
But if you're Sony, you are getting a cut of that. And in addition to that, every game that's sold for either the Dreamcast or the PlayStation sends a chunk back to the manufacturer of the hardware. There's a licensing fee to make a game. So you can subsidize the cost of your hardware with this.
Well,
And
this is usually how it works in the console market,
Exactly.
especially during the release of the console.
This is how it works post NES.
Yeah.
Before the NES, this system didn't exist.
Yeah, I'm talking
Yeah.
of the time that I can grasp with my,
With
experience.
the limited experience that you have, I understand.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Again, there's more for me to come than for you. Just saying.
I understand. But yeah, so it's hard. It's hard. Yeah. It's hard to. Yeah, it's hard to overstate the
It's just hard.
$290, the extra $100 for the PS2. I honestly thought at the time that was going to be the deal breaker. That extra $100 was really going to hurt the PlayStation 2.
Well, maybe it was the deal maker, like premium product, more price justified.
In a certain way, you may actually be right, but I think ultimately what killed the Dreamcast was the single analog stick.
Oh, yeah, okay.
The single analog stick, and well, it didn't have John Madden football. That was another big one. Yeah. But in North America, but just playing those games without the dual analog stick, moving through a 3D world without that, is just a pain in the ass. And they needed that dual analog stick.
I mean, they could just bring like a control update.
Well, yes, but remember, then what percentage of people have the old stick, the old controller, what percentage has the new controller, and are you going to develop the game to be controlled with which of the two systems? This is always the problem with an add-on to a console.
Yeah, okay.
That the developer has to try to sell to as many people as possible. If they make the game, they're going to make it for the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
And so now once they were stuck with that, found a Bernie Stoller interview where he actually talked about how he tried to convince Japan to add a second analog stick, and they just would not do it. So go figure.
Second analog stick? Are you crazy?
Yeah, especially since PlayStation had already done it.
Yeah.
But go figure. And our last story for 1999.
And in accordance to our foreshadowing episode, the Game Boy Advance is announced.
Yes, so we're sticking with big announcements for the future. While Game
no
Boy
content
Advance
today.
isn't supposed to be the final name of the system, they would drop the D at the end of advanced. Nintendo's successor to the Game Boy line is scheduled for an August 2000 release in Japan, a launch date it would miss by 10 whole months. It would have the amazing backward compatibility, though, and get close to 20-hour battery life. Now, granted, that was mainly due to the lack of a much-needed backlight.
Oh, yeah, and this thing was needed.
Oh, yeah, no,
Yeah.
the thing was unplayable, actually, unless you were in the middle of the sunlight.
Oh, well, I mean,
But
growing up with a Game Boy Color, I was totally used to, like, having no backlight. It was no problem for me back in the time, but no, digging out the thing of my, old room. I had the thing in my hand, it was totally unplayable.
oh, it was unplayable back then,
was-
trust me. Yeah.
Well, as a kid,
I know. But the fact that it got 20 hours of battery life, even without the backlight,
It's
was
not
impressive. But you can tell that certain technical hurdles still had yet to be overcome.
Yeah.
The real thing here is it misses the launch date by 10 months. So literally they are announcing this in the November issues. It's not going to come out until deep into 2001. November issues of 99.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine that given the number of competitors hitting the market, we talked about the Wonder Swan and Neo Geo Pocket multiple times in the last few episodes, makes sense Big N would want to get their next handheld into the spotlight as quickly as possible and steal back some of their competitors' thunder. And they did that, I think, quite effectively here. But it is a little bit of dirty maneuver just because this thing is still so far out into the future. I mean, it's 2 years out basically, and they're announcing it. Why? Oh yeah, because there's suddenly some real competition on the market. And
So they basically killed the competition.
just like Sony basically tried to do the same thing to Sega and succeeded, I
Yep.
think here something similar happened. And now, did I ever think the Wonder Swan or the Neo Geo Pocket were going to make any real inroads into North America? No. But still, it would have been nice to see some more competition in the handheld market than what we ended up with.
I'm wondering, was there ever, I mean, besides the PS Portable and the PS Vita, was there any mention-worthy competition to Nintendo's handhelds?
Oh, well, you had the Lynx. And when the Game Boy came out, it went up against the Lynx originally.
Yeah.
And the Wonder Swan and
After
Neo
that.
Geo Pocket and Neo Geo Pocket Color were not insignificant systems. But you never had anybody who could really take on the juggernaut that was Nintendo because Nintendo had the properties.
And also, I can't remember any Wonder Swans or Neo Geo Pockets in the retail stores, at least here in Germany.
No, over here, if I don't believe either one ever got an official release over here. And if they
Okay.
did, it was extremely limited.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even in the States, they were almost impossible to find. I don't even think the Wonder Swan got a U.S. release. I'd have to check. But the Neo Geo Pocket it did get a release, and it was extremely limited. Yeah, so
Oh well.
c'est la vie. That is the end of our time travels. And that also basically brings to an end the first anniversary episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
Can you edit in some happy birthday music?
Well, it is copyright free now, so in theory we could. Happy birthday to you.
Well, this is definitely
Happy
copyright free.
birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear podcast. Happy birthday to you. Blow out the candles. There you go. Woohoo! Okay,
This is
everybody.
the moment where I just had to shut up, end.
No, we still have to plug the YouTube channel and the Patreon and the Twitter and the email address and tell everybody.
Well, just do this and then you sing again, and I'm like.
No. I sang twice already this time. Believe me. If we want to have any future listeners, we stop now. So that's pretty much it. Okay, but yes, everybody follow us on Twitter. Leave comments. Please leave some comments, be it an Apple or wherever. YouTube. Sign up for our YouTube channel.
Oh, and send us the name of this music synthesizer thingy,
Which one?
The one we talked about in 1989, the one for the transition sounds we want to use.
Oh, that's stupid. It's not a synthesizer. That was just a musical instrument.
This is why I said thingy.
Okay, yes. The very technical terminology you're using
Yes.
there. Yes. Yeah, why it's way too late for us to be recording this. Okay, so with all of that being said, hope you guys had a good time. Hope to see you back again next month. And for those who are the Patreons, hopefully we'll have an extra episode or two in the meantime for you. And with that being said,
Have fun.